All right, welcome everybody. Welcome to another edition of our biweekly wilderness medicine lecture series. We're glad you could make it. It's been a few weeks since our last talk here, but we've got a very special speaker for you today. I'm sure more folks are going to trickle in, but everyone's got, I'm sure, busy schedules with exams and whatnot. So we'll just get things going here. If this is your first time here at GOWME, welcome. Um, our mission here is to, again, showcase interesting careers and perspectives in wilderness and emergency medicine. We really aim to create this community of wilderness medicine enthusiasts and experts. We've been going for, I'd say, over 4 years now. Our community has really grown to be worldwide. So we're very proud of that. If you haven't yet, I recommend you join our mailing list. You can scan this QR code with your phone and gain access to our lectures as well as various opportunities. We do have a fellowship showcase coming up probably in another month or two, so be sure to catch that if you're available. As well, we like to give out free stuff. So if nothing else, that's always a great opportunity. We also are active on YouTube where we post most of our lectures, as well as Instagram. So definitely check those out. Here's some of our lovely e-board members. And that brings us to our speaker of today, Dr. Ken Kamler. So Dr. Kamler is an orthopedic surgeon who practices hand surgery in New York, but also practices extreme medicine in the most remote regions on Earth, including the Arctic, Antarctic, Amazon, Africa, the Himalayas, and weightlessness aboard NASA flights and undersea and mock space capsules. He's been the doctor on over 20 research expeditions, including 6 to Everest, funded by National Geographic, as well as NASA. He's been to Kilimanjaro with the U.S. Army. He's been on a Norwegian salvage ship to recover the Apollo 11 rocket engine. He's been to Bhutan, to Kazakhstan, to Ukraine. I gotta say, I've actually had to truncate his biography. He's been to so many places. But most recently, he went to the Andes for a NASA study of glacial recession. Dr. Kamler has also authored 2 books on survival, Doctor on Everest and Surviving the Extremes. He's given 2 national TED Talks written for National Geographic as a frequent guest on national radio and TV programs. I saw he was on Oprah once. I really did cut down on the things this guy's done. It's been pretty incredible. He's been on several documentaries, is a former vice president and an 18-year director of the Explorers Club. Dr. Kamler's been awarded several times, and I got to say, I haven't seen many resumes like this. So I'm really excited to host him here on GOME, and I can't wait to hear what he's got to say to us today. So that's the intro. I do recommend if you're in an environment where you can, I invite you to turn your cameras on so that myself and Dr. Kamler can see you. And if you have any questions for Dr. Kamler, feel free to post them in the chat. We will also have time for some Q&A at the very end. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Dr. Kamler, you can take it away.
Okay. Thank you, Nate, for that nice introduction. Yeah, I thought I would give you a firsthand commentary here on an experience I had on Mount Everest, which I'm happy to tell you about. So we'll get started here. This is Mount Everest. It's 29,035 feet high. And if you think about it, that's almost a cruising altitude for a transatlantic jet. It's one of the harshest, most remote areas in the world. And I've been there 6 times with National Geographic and with NASA. It was on my 4th trip that the comet Hayakutake passed over the mountain. And the Sherpas all told us that's a really bad omen, but we persisted with our expedition. And later on, when we were up near the summit in our most vulnerable position, a vicious storm hit the mountain. It was the worst storm, still is, in human history on Mount Everest. and it lasted for 2 days. And during those 2 days, I was the only doctor high up on the mountain. The journey starts in Kathmandu. You see here a very busy, bustling city. From there, we take a flight to Lukla, which is a tiny town with an airstrip and a very dangerous place to land a plane. As you can see, there's a crashed plane off to the runway here, just to remind you how dangerous it is. And from there, we go up 7,000 feet more to a 9,000 foot level. And this is a picture of the yaks that we use to transport our gear. This expedition had 55 yaks, and as the medical officer for the group, I was assigned 4 yaks. So these are 2 of my 4 yaks. Packing for these kind of expeditions is very, very tricky and much more complicated than you might think, because you have to pack your fragile stuff like ophthalmoscopes wrapped inside your soft stuff like the bandages, and you have to put heavier stuff distributed among your 4 yaks because they have to be able to bear the load. And also, it's a kind of tricky climb up to base camp. So if one of the yaks goes off a cliff, you don't want to lose all of any one supply. So it's important that you distribute it throughout all the yaks. And also, you have to bear in mind that you're going to pass people in the villages who haven't seen medical care, and you have to bring a lot of extra supplies just to treat them. All right, so here's our yak train moving out across one of the bridges, which is on past the last village. And we move up onto the Khumbu Glacier. And from there, we reach base camp. Base camp is at 17,500 feet. It's the highest point the yaks can go before the climb gets technical. So that's where we build our base camp. You can see here, we're on the glacier, but it's covered with debris, since debris constantly falls off the slopes of the mountain and it just sort of accumulates on top. There's a very thin veneer of debris overlaying the glacier. This is a view from my tent. And you can see the tan tent is the combination of where we keep our medical supplies and where we eat, actually. So we're here for about 3 months. That's how long it takes to make this expedition happen. So the route starts at base camp, you see down here at 17,500 feet. Then we climb 2,000 feet through the first part, which is called the ice fall. And from there, it's another 2,000 feet up a more gradual slope called the Western GOWME. And at the top of that, we make Camp 2. From there, we have to climb Lhotse, which is the 4th highest mountain in the world, but it's dwarfed by Everest. It's such a high, it's too high to do in one day. So we go halfway up Lhotse and build Camp 3. And then from there, we do a traverse to what's called the South Col, where we put Camp 4. That's the highest camp. It's between Lhotse and Everest. The summit of Everest is still 3,000 feet higher, but this is the highest camp we make. The Everest is a really extreme environment. There's only 1/3 as much oxygen near the top as there is at sea level, so your body is unable to generate enough heat. It's like a smoldering fire. Your metabolism can't really ever get going. So it's hard to generate heat. It's hard to generate strength and power. And your judgment is clouded because you can't get enough oxygen into your brain. At sea level, the body consumes about 5% of its oxygen just for respiration. But up near the summit of Everest, it consumes about 60% of its oxygen just for breathing. Your heart is pounding even at rest up near the summit. Then on summit day, you might be out 16 to 20 hours. Temperature could be 40 degrees below zero. You could have winds of 20 to 40 miles an hour. And that can be equal to a summer day on Mars. I remember one day when I was up near the summit, I reached inside my down jacket for my water bottle. And when I took it out, I found that the water was frozen and it was inside my down jacket. So that tells you just how close you are to the limit of survival. And that's the area where the disaster occurred. Okay, so back at base camp, here I am setting up my medical tent. I had 4 yaks. They dumped all their supplies on my tent floor, and here I am getting ready to try to sort this out into a workable camp. Uh, but before I could even get going, before I even got my tent fully set up, a Sherpa higher up on the mountain fell off a ladder that he was trying to cross a crevasse. He fell upside down into the crevasse and he was refrigerated there upside down for about half an hour. I was still at base camp, but I was in radio contact with the rescuers. They pulled him out, put him on a ladder, and at first the climber was awake, but then in a few minutes he lapsed into unconsciousness, which was a key sign to me that he had sustained a subdural hematoma. So they brought him down to me at base camp, and here he was with a fractured skull. His pupils were fixed and dilated. He was really in critical condition. So I did what I could, but I really didn't think he would survive the night. But I was working on him through the night, and the Sherpas, some of the Sherpas who were working with us, came into the tent and sat around the Sherpa, the critically injured Sherpa, and started chanting. And it was a kind of hypnotic, low humming chant that was, it sort of hypnotized me for the whole night. I would look up at an IV bag and see that it had been changed, and then just realize that it must have been me who changed it. So it was really a strange evening, but I really had the feeling that if they had stopped their chanting, the Sherpa would die. Anyway, morning came, and the Sherpa started cursing at me. And when I asked what he was saying, they told me that he was cursing because I had restrained his arms and he wanted to break free. So he had survived the night. Amazingly, had survived the night. We were able to helicopter him out from base camp. And 2 months later, he actually came back and rejoined the expedition. I was a busy doctor. There were lots of injuries to take care of. This is a patient who had gastritis, which he picked up in Kathmandu by drinking contaminated water. We saw a lot of chest and lung problems. If you notice in the background here, this is a plastic shoe rack, which I hung up from on the tent. It's a great way to store your medical supplies. This Sherpa had an ice block fall on his ankle, fracturing it. And this Sherpa actually had a dislocated knee, which I was able to reduce and then brace with a STAM splint. Here I'm treating a fractured wrist by putting a cast on the Sherpa. And this is a climber I treated with snow blindness. Snow blindness is actually a sunburn of the cornea, and it causes temporary but complete blindness, and it's very painful. So if you're at base camp, you can treat it pretty well. If this occurs high up on the mountain, though, it's often fatal because if you're blind and you're trying to get down from near the summit of Everest, it's probably not going to happen. And there was a lot of blunt trauma. People fell or things fell on them. And here we are using a ultrasound to check for free air under a diaphragm. But not all the injuries were that serious. This is a Sherpa who came to me with severe stomach pain. But on further questioning, it turned out that he was drinking Chang, which is their homemade brew that they like to drink at night. He had had a little too much of it, and his abdominal pain was nothing more than something that he had to just rest and sleep it off. I thought it was appendicitis at first, so I was relieved to find out it was only too much Chang. So my team was a group of scientists, engineers, climbers, put together or organized by the Explorers Club. And besides us, there were 3 other expeditions on the mountain. There was Scott Fisher's American team and Rob Hall's New Zealand team, as well as an IMAX team that was there to film the movie. We were there following a NASA protocol. We would equip the climbers with remote sensing devices, devices that would measure heart rate, respiration, skin temperature, core temperature. They would swallow pills to broadcast core temperature, oxygen saturation, and they wore GPS monitors. So that way we could monitor where they were at any point and what their medical condition was at any point in the climb. So this had tremendous value as a tool for any kind of rescue, any kind of wilderness rescue. And we were also partly funded by the Army because obviously this would have tremendous advantage for medics in a battlefield situation, or smoke jumpers, or anybody else in the wilderness who needed to be monitored. And as we collected the gear, the information, we would monitor it at base camp, and then we would also add our own stuff. We would augment it with heart sounds and breath sounds, and took EKGs. We did sonograms. We even made microscope slides, and we could do videos. And then all this information was digitized, and then we transmitted it by satellite in real time to Yale and Walter Reed hospitals. And we could call in any kind of experts from either of those hospitals that we wanted for advice. We did this by having grand rounds. We had telemedicine grand rounds with those hospitals, and they both said that these were by far the best attended grand rounds they ever had. And we did TV shows. We did the first ever live interview from Everest Base Camp with the news show Nightline. Here we are preparing for our oxygen tanks for higher up. These oxygen tanks are made of titanium. They only weigh 7 pounds. They're very thin shelled, and they're illegal in the United States. So the only way we could get them was to have them sent directly from Russia to Nepal. So the quality control is definitely marginal. So we had to check every cylinder that we plan to use. And we had to check out our oxygen masks. They were non-rebreathers for continuous flow, and we had to find out if there was any problems at base camp before we started using them higher up. Here's a climber that was brought down to me from altitude. He was coughing, had wet lungs. He obviously had pulmonary edema, or HAPE. And he also had some ataxia and some confusion. So I figured there was some cerebral edema involved also, the HACE. So I treated him with some dexamethasone and then stabilized him with supplemental oxygen. But oxygen supplies are limited on Everest. So we transferred him to a GOWME bag. This is a canvas tube that you put the patient inside of, and then with a foot pedal, as you see here, you can maintain a higher pressurized air. And it's equivalent to dropping the altitude about 2,000 feet. So we did that when this climber came around. We prepared him for evacuation, but this time we couldn't get a helicopter because of the weather. So we had to take him out overland. And that involved a long run before we dropped any altitude. So I gave the rescuers some extra dexamethasone to give him in boluses along the way, on the way down. Okay, after about 2 months, we've acclimatized. We've set up camps all the way up the mountain. We've put in ropes and ladders, and we're about ready to go for the summit. So Rob's American team, Rob's New Zealand team, Scott's American team, they both left one day ahead of us. So the first part is through the ice fall, the first 2,000 feet that you see here. But before we left, we held a ceremony at base camp. The Sherpas wanted to bless our ice axes. You see them doing that here, and we added in we asked them to add in our stethoscopes so we could have them blessed as well. So the first part of the climb is the ice fall. It's 2,000 feet, and it's actually like a moving waterfall, very slowly. It actually moves, but it's frozen. So you can hear it cracking and groaning and creaking as you climb it. And every day you go through this, it's different because it changes daily. And going through this, you're like a rat going through a maze. You can't see over the top. So you just have to sort of depend on your lead climbers who've set in ropes and ladders to get you through the crevasses. These are climbers going through the ice fall. They're up near the top of the ice fall. We go through in the middle of the night when the atmosphere is the coldest temperature possible, because we're climbing along these giant ice blocks the size of buildings, and we want them to stay frozen. In the daytime, they warm and they can collapse. So here's some climbers getting through the ice fall, and the sun's just about coming up, so they're pretty much in good shape. Here's a picture of me crossing one of the crevasses. As you can see, we drop ladders across them, and you go across step by step very carefully. I'm tied in by my harness to safety ropes. Hopefully they hold if you slip off the ladder, which is easy to do because there's a wind that makes you sort of tilt to one side, and then sometimes the wind will stop suddenly. So it's easy to lose your balance. This is a picture of my partner actually crossing an ice fall. This is at least 10 stories deep, probably deeper. He likes to say that we try to cross these crevasses at night, because if we ever saw what we were doing during the day, we wouldn't do it. Okay, crevasses get wider as you go higher. This crevasse had to be bridged with tying 5 ladders together. And as you walk across a long span like that, it's like going out on a diving board. The ladder bends in the middle, and you find yourself sometimes at the bottom of the crevasse when you're in the middle. And then as you continue on up, you come back up out from the other side. But some crevasses are so big that you can't bridge them with ladders. You have to just climb down into it on one side and then climb up out of it on the other side. And once you get through the ice fall, we put Camp 1. This is the first flat spot at the top of the ice fall. It's a precarious spot, and it looks beautiful in the picture, but it's very cold and windy. This picture was taken before we actually built an ice wall around the tents just to protect from the wind. So we spend the night there at Camp 1, and then from there we go up the Western GOWME. It's another 2,000 feet. It's much gentler than the ice fall, but it's kind of endless. You go over just ice dune after ice dune, just endlessly for 2,000 feet as you gain altitude. And you come over to Camp 2, which is over here. Camp 2 is placed on a lateral moraine. It's a piece of rock, which is very rare on Everest. It's almost all ice covered. There's very few areas of rock. But we take advantage of that to put Camp 2. It's flatter than mostly everything else, and it's warmer. So this is the last comfortable, so to speak, spot on your climb. From here, you're 8,000 feet from the summit, and it will take 3 days if everything goes smoothly to get there. And there's no place to rest higher up. This is the last place where you can actually rest. So it's critical to watch the weather here and try to predict 3 good days of weather so that you can get up to the summit and back down before the weather turns, because you're really out exposed the rest of the way up. So Rob and Scott were at this point, and they decided that the weather looked good and they would make their bid for the summit. My team was a day behind them. We just sort of pulled into Camp 2 when they were leaving. The next part of the climb over Camp 2 is the Lhotse Face. It's 5,000 feet, 4th highest mountain in the world. And we climb it on fixed ropes. The ropes are anchored into the ice because it's so sheer that it's at 45 degrees. If you slip with the fixed rope in place, you'll fall maybe 250 feet. But without a fixed rope in place, you could fall 5,000 feet. It's an unrelenting, very difficult arduous slope to climb. And you can see this is looking back down Lhotse toward Camp 2 over here. This is the Western Combe that we just went up. And at the edge here, you could see this is the top of the ice fall. Camp 1 would be down below the ice fall there. So here climbers are coming up onto Camp 3. And this picture is taken at Camp 3. You can see the slope, the 45-degree relentless slope of Lhotse that you have to climb. There's really no place to put a camp here. So what we do is we just chop a ledge into the ice and pitch our tents on this ledge. A very precarious place to be and very uncomfortable. And you see here that going up toward the slope up toward the top of Everest, there's no snow. And that's because Everest at this altitude is in the jet stream and it's constantly scoured by winds. The winds are getting blown off the face so that they don't accumulate. And what you see here, what looks like a cloud behind the summit ridge is in fact a snow plume being blown off. And we can judge the winds high up there by the length of the snow plume. So from Camp 3, we do a traverse to Camp 4. And here we're moving up into the clouds. We start using oxygen at this point, and we're on fixed ropes again and moving up to the final camp, Camp 4. Here's the approach to Camp 4. We're coming up this way. You can see the tents that we've put in on previous climbs. These tents are between the summit of Lhotse over here and the summit of Everest over here. It's just 3,000 feet below the summit. We get there in the afternoon, and we get into our tents. So we have another 3,000 feet to go. And given that supplies are so limited, we don't have that much oxygen. The choice has to be made at that point. If the weather's good, you go for the summit that night. If the weather's bad, you have to go down. You have to either go up or go down. You can't sort of hang out at Camp 4. It's a miserable place to be, and our oxygen supplies are very limited. So here's two climbers resting at Camp 4, sort of waiting for the weather and getting ready to climb that night if things work out. This is a picture of Rob Hall, the leader of the New Zealand team. This is actually the last picture ever taken of Rob Hall. And this is his radio, which actually played a fateful role later on. This is Yasuko Namba. She's one of the climbers on the New Zealand team, famous Japanese climber, just waiting and watching the weather. And you can see here, these winds are too strong. If it stays like that, there can't be any summit attempt. But then around midnight, the wind suddenly died down. It became calm and still. And it seemed all of a sudden that it would be a perfect summit night. So Rob's team and Scott's team started out for the summit. This is the first part of the climb. It's called the triangular face. This part can be done at night with headlights because it's not so precipitous as what comes later. You try to time that part of the climb to arrive at the southeast ridge just at sunrise. If you get there too early, you can't do the southeast ridge in the dark. So if you're there too early and it's still dark, you have to just sort of hang around and get cold. If you get there too late, then you've lost some precious daylight time. So you try to time it just to get there as the sun is rising. And these climbers actually did that. So they took a quick break and then started up onto the southeast ridge. This is the last part of the summit climb. It's 1,500 feet, and it's like walking along a knife edge. It's never wider than about 6 feet, and often just as the narrowness of your footprint. It goes up at about a 30-degree angle on average, and it's sort of tilted cockeyed, 15 degrees from right to left mostly. And it's not straight, it's sinuous. So at this height, you have clouds passing through you as you climb. And when a cloud passes through you, you can't see your feet. And if you can't see your feet, you can't take a step. So when the cloud comes through, you just have to stop and wait for it to pass by so that you can see your foot and make your next step and make sure you're coming down on something. So it becomes a very slow, arduous climb, the last 1,500 feet. Well, the climbers were up in that area when the wind suddenly picked up. It's out of nowhere, it seemed like the storm was coming in. So at this point, some climbers turned around and went back down to camp 4, but some others persisted. It takes about a year to plan your Everest expedition. You're on the mountain for 3 months, and now you're only about 2 hours from the summit. So there's a tremendous temptation to just forge ahead, especially when you're not getting much oxygen and you can have clouded judgment very easily. So some other climbers pushed on after the others turned back. Now, this is a picture of me taken a year earlier in that same place to give you an idea of what it was like at that point. This is me on the summit ridge, and these climbers would be looking just like this. They'd be completely covered over using face masks and balaclavas and completely covered over. This is the oxygen mask setup. We're carrying a spare oxygen tank in our backpack and connected by a hose through that to our regulators. Beside this, probably all we would have would be maybe a chocolate bar, an extra pair of gloves, and a water bottle. This is a view looking back down the southeast ridge from the direction of the summit down, looking down. Climbers are making their way up. And if you look here, you can see that they're strung out. They're no longer roped together. And that's because the fall off is so severe at this point that if you slip and fall, it's going to be like a free fall. And you'll just pull off whoever you're roped with. So we unrope and we each climb on our own, bearing in mind that if you fall to your left, you're going to fall 8,000 feet into Nepal. And if you fall to your right, you're going to fall 12,000 feet into Tibet. So if you're going to fall, you might as well fall into Tibet because you'll live longer. But either way, you fall for the rest of your life. All right, well, those climbers were up on the summit ridge. My team was at Camp 3, a day behind, 2,000 feet below that ridge. We were listening on our radios to their progress, and we heard jubilation and champagne corks popping when Rob Hall announced that he had reached the summit. But he had only reached with 3 other climbers. The rest of his team, 8 other climbers, had not summited. And the wind was getting worse and worse, and it was already 2:30 in the afternoon, which is a very late time to be leaving the summit. When you're at the summit, you're only halfway there. You have to get down. Getting up is optional, but getting down is mandatory. So these climbers were in a pretty dicey position with the wind picking up, and we were just hoping they'd all get back down to Camp 4 safely. So we spent hours just sort of looking at our radio, hoping for some good news. Instead, we got the chilling report that Rob was still up near the summit with another climber on his team, Doug Hansen. They were up in this area over here. Doug was out of oxygen and too weak to descend the Hillary Step, which is this rock face here, which is ordinarily not that hard a descent, but when you're exhausted, freezing, and wearing ice boots instead of climbing boots, it becomes technically very difficult. And Doug and Rob were stuck up here. Rob didn't want to leave Doug, and they were both sort of stuck up there. Besides that, we didn't know what had happened to the rest of the New Zealand team, and we had no reports from Scott's American team. Plus, there was a Taiwanese climber, Makalu Gao, who also had made a summit attempt, but hadn't been heard from. In our tents at 3, we were getting all these radio reports. They were all confusing. Most were conflicting. Besides Rob, we had heard that his guide, Andy Harris, had summited, but hadn't been heard from, didn't return to Camp 4. Scott Fisher hadn't summited, and no one knew where he was. Yasuko Namba had summited, but hadn't made it back to Camp 4. Makalu Gao had summited and not made it back. And another climber, Beck Weathers, who was climbing also with the New Zealand team, hadn't summited and hadn't made it back. John Krakauer, who later wrote the book Into Thin Air, had gotten back to Camp 4, and he described that he was from the tent that he was in. He was unable to see outside his tent because there was a total whiteout, and what that meant was the climbers wouldn't be able to see Camp 4 if they tried to return, from the summit direction. So all in all, 18 climbers were unaccounted for, and it got dark. The storm raged on throughout the night. Vicious, vicious storm. The wind, we were at Camp 3. We were in 2 tents at Camp 3, only separated by a couple of feet. But yet we couldn't even communicate with each other by shouting even, because the noise from the wind was like a freight train running through camp. So we had to communicate by radio. And our 2 strongest climbers, Todd Burleson and Pete Athens, were in different tents. They got on the radio, and the first thing they said to each other was, "How quick can you get ready?" They never said, should we try to mount a rescue? What should we do? The first words were, "How quick can you get ready?" There was no doubt in their minds that they were going to try to make a rescue. So they got all ready to go, and then just before they left, they sent a radio message to Rob. I expected the message to be something like, "Hang on, Rob, we're coming," something like that. But instead, their message to Rob was to abandon Doug. They said, "You have no chance if you stay with Doug. Come down by yourself." And Rob's answer was, "We're both listening." So Todd and Pete got to the col. They made their way up through a swirling wind, got to the col, the South Col up in here where the Camp 4 was. They described a scene of complete chaos. They said the tents were ripped. There was gear strewn everywhere. Some climbers had made it back and said they had found Beck Weathers lying dead in the snow. Other people were missing. People were in the wrong tents. They couldn't even tell who was back and who wasn't. And there was lots of frostbite and lots of hypothermia. I was at Camp 3 giving radio advice to Todd and Pete, although they were very experienced climbers and pretty much knew what to do anyway. But Camp 3 is no place you can treat anybody. You can't even stand up, really. It's so precipitous there that you have to rope up to go to the bathroom. People have died actually going to the bathroom without roping up at Camp 3. And all I had with me for medical supplies were 2 Ziploc bags. One of them had dexamethasone in it. One of them had Demerol in it. They were both on preloaded syringes, but they were completely frozen. So while we were in radio contact, while I was in radio contact with Todd and Pete, Todd said, Todd looked out his tent, out the tent window as he was rehydrating somebody, and he saw somebody staggering around out there. He thought it was one of the climbers who had returned and had gone out to try to urinate. So Todd went out to help him. And to his complete shock and amazement, that was Beck Weathers. He had been reported dead by the other climbers, but here he was staggering his way toward camp. So Todd quickly brought him into the camp, and other climbers had found Makalu Gao, the Taiwanese climber, still alive, but barely. and they brought him into Camp 4 also. So I could radio triage with Todd and Pete, and there was a lull in the wind. So we decided to try to take advantage of that lull in the wind and send down whichever climbers were capable of going down. So we felt like all the climbers could make their way down from Camp 4 to me at Camp 3, except for Beck and Makalu. They were just in too critical condition to make an attempt to walk down to Camp 3. So the climbers came down past me at Camp 3, and during that time getting ready for them, I was able to thaw out my 2 Ziploc bags of medicines by putting them inside my jacket under my armpit. I got them back to liquid state, and as the climbers came by me, I assessed, their condition. Nobody needed pain meds, but some of them were somewhat ataxic and confused. And when that was the case, I was thinking maybe they had some cerebral edema, and to help them out, I would inject them with dexamethasone. There was no nicety about rolling up your sleeve or anything like that. I would just inject them right through their clothes. And that would give them a lucid interval, to allow them to try to make their way back down to Camp 2. Meanwhile, the wind picked up again very quickly, and Rob's ordeal continued. He was unreachable as if he was on the moon. He said by radio that he was alone now, and obviously Doug had died. So we tried to encourage Rob to get up and move, but he said he's just too weak to get up. Some Sherpas had made it up to Camp 4 in the meantime, and they volunteered to go to try to rescue Rob. But they started up the southeast bridge, and they were beaten back by the wind. So Rob was told that the Sherpas would not be able to come rescue him, and he knew what that meant. So he asked if he could be patched in by his radio to his wife, Jan, who was home in New Zealand. Jan was a longtime friend of mine. We had been on Everest together for 4 trips. I knew her really well. And the only reason she wasn't with Rob this year was because she was pregnant. She was 7 months pregnant with their first baby. So Rob was patched in to Jan back home in New Zealand. And they had their conversation. They named their baby, and then Rob signed off, and he said he's signing off so he can rest. That was the last time Rob was ever heard from. That night was the strongest winds I've ever experienced. We were at Camp 3, about over here. We were perched on that little ice shelf where our tent was held in by ice screws. We were afraid that the wind would just pull the ice screws right out of the ice, or else the tent would shred and we'd go tumbling down the rest of the way down the Lhotse face. So we stayed fully dressed that night and splayed out on the bottoms of our tent, just trying to hold them down. In the morning, we heard that Beck and Makalu had both survived the night, and they would be brought down to me by Todd and Pete, brought down to me at Camp 2. So I down climbed the rest of Lhotse to get down to Camp 2 to meet the climbers. 3,000-foot down climb to Camp 2 down here, 21,000 feet. 21,000 feet is a little better than where I was at 23,000, and it's flat, and it's a place where you can actually treat people. So I came down to 2 to await my patients. But at Camp 2, I only had a tackle box of supplies. These were the extent of my supplies at Camp 2. But I radioed the day before. I had anticipated this, so I radioed down to the base camp and asked them to send up a whole lot more supplies. And the Sherpas were able to bring them up through the icefall, bring up supplies which we normally never bring that high on the mountain, but this was a critical condition. So at Camp 2, this was the New Zealand mess tent at Camp 2. It was the largest tent at Camp 2. And this picture was taken in happier times at Camp 2. So what I did was I commandeered this tent and made it into a makeshift hospital with a lot of help from the Sherpas. I laid sleeping bags and foam mats on the ground, on the floor, on the ice, and then collected dry clothes and boots. I opened IV bags and hung them from the tent frame, opened O2 bottles and connected them to regulators, laid out bandages and medications that I thought I'd need, and had the Sherpas boil up water. And by radio, I kept abreast of the progress of my two soon-to-be patients coming down the mountain. And I drank some tea and just tried to stay focused, which is not easy to do at 21,000 feet where tying your shoes can be complicated. Makalu arrived first. He was in a heavy down suit, and I laid him down on a sleeping bag. We put oxygen on him right away. He was wet down to his underwear, so we had to take off all his clothes. We changed him into a completely new set of clothes. And I evaluated his condition. He had really horrible frostbite. You could see here his fingers were all gray. They were like gray sausages. His hand was so cold that even though it was 0 degrees in the tent, when I held his hand up to my cheek, I could feel cold radiating off it. These were his feet. You can see the demarcation here of frozen out a third of his foot and his heels. They were completely frozen. Here I am cutting away a piece of sock which was stuck to his foot. His feet were alive, though. I found pulses. He had pulses going, so I wanted to keep track of that. I marked them with a pen. This was his nose. It was just a brittle, dry crust. I checked his eyes. I found that he could see partially, but he did have snow blindness. I started an IV, giving him nifedipine, which has the effect of redirecting blood flow into the extremities, which is a good way to treat frostbite, but it can lower the core body blood pressure. And I didn't have a blood pressure cuff. So what I did was I monitored his blood pressure by periodically checking his carotid pulsations. We put him back on oxygen. And he hadn't eaten for 2 days. So we gave him some soup. And you can see here the incredible amount of facial edema he had when we first got him. But then after some soup and some warming, you can see how the edema rapidly subsided. I put his hands and feet in tubs of warm water to try to bring on to try to, defrost his feet. It was critical to maintain the temperature at about 104 degrees, which is no easy task when the tent is 0 degrees. So the water cooled very rapidly because putting his feet in there was like putting ice blocks in the warm water. And I had these little thermometers, these little tape thermometers that I kept in each bowl to try to monitor the water temperature. It was a big job because the water changed rapidly. So I had a lot of Sherpas giving me a lot of help. They would titrate the water. They would drain off the water when it cooled and add some more hot to try to keep the temperature at about right. The decision to thaw out somebody with frostbite is a very tricky one. It's not as straightforward as you might think. You can't thaw out the hands or the feet if there's any chance that they're going to refreeze. You have to be sure that once you thaw him, he'll stay thawed until the end of the rescue, because it's worse to thaw out an extremity and then have it refreeze. That causes twice as much damage. It's better, if you're not sure, to just leave it frozen. But I felt I had a lot of help, and we would be able to maintain his feet and hands thawed out once we got him going. Uh, and the other condition that you have to consider, which also makes it tricky to go ahead and thaw him out, is if you thaw out his hands and feet and don't bring his core temperature up simultaneously, you get a situation where the blood in the hands and the feet become liquid. They start to flow. They'll flow in toward the heart. And if the heart is still cold, it'll be fragile and brittle, and it will not be able to accommodate an influx of cold blood, and it'll go into arrhythmia. And there are many cases of climbers surviving the being being out in the cold, but dying when they're being thawed out. It's a real risk. You got to make sure that the core temperature comes up the same rate as the thawing of the extremities. Anyway, just as we were getting Makalu, oh, one more thing. You got to make sure if you take your shoes off that you have bigger boots to put back on, because once you take off the boots off the frozen feet, they're going to swell, and you will not be able to get those boots back on. So you have to have other boots, bigger size, to put back on. It's another thing you have to think of before you thaw them out. Anyway, just as we were getting Makalu under control, Beck arrived. I expected an incoherent phantom to be dragged in, but in fact, Beck walked in half under his own power and half being held up on either side by his rescuers. Beck looked into the tent, and the first thing he said to me was, "Hi, Ken, where should I sit?" So I laid Beck down on a mat next to Makalu, and then Beck said to me, "Do you accept my insurance?" Which was not only funny, but it was great to hear, because that meant he was really completely lucid, which was just great news. However, Makalu had the worst frostbite I had ever seen, but that was only until I saw Beck. Beck's frostbite was worse. Both hands were purple. His right forearm was frozen midway up, as you can see here. His face and his nose were black, and he had no pulse, no blisters, was feeling no sensation in his hand, and no pain. He had the hand of a dead man, but yet the muscles in his forearm were still alive, so he was able to move his fingers. And he would just ask me, "Are my fingers moving?" Well, I followed the same routine for Beck as I had for Makalu, and Beck talked casually as I was treating him. If you had just listened to the conversation and not seen what was going on, you would have thought he just stopped by for tea. He said he had gotten blurry vision as he was starting to climb, and he got lost and exhausted on the way up. And in the whiteout, he couldn't see anything at all. He felt that he was freezing, and his hand was frozen. So he opened his jacket to put his gloved hand inside his jacket to try to warm it up. But before he could actually get it inside, he collapsed in the snow, and he laid there. He said he was not unconscious, but he was unable to move. He couldn't even blink. He just laid there in the snow, and he heard some climbers coming back from their summit attempt, trying to get to Camp 4. They saw him laying in the snow, and he heard them say, "He's dead." And they moved on. And Beck laid in the snow for a day, a night, and another day. And then he started to think to himself, he's not ready to die. He's got too much to live for. And with an incredible force of will, Beck stood up. And equally amazing, he was able to reason. He still couldn't see, but he was able to reason that he had the wind at his back as he was climbing. So if he had any chance of finding Camp 4, he would have to face into the wind. He did that. He staggered forward into the wind. He said after a while, he saw some blue rocks, and he moved toward the blue rocks. But those rocks were, in fact, the tents of Camp 4. And as he got close, that was when Todd saw him outside staggering around and came out and pulled him into the tent. Beck told that story matter-of-factly, but I was absolutely awestruck by the power of his will. It was something that just, shouldn't have happened, so-called. Beck was a doctor, but I guess he never read that chapter on hypothermia that says that once you become hypothermic below 70 degrees, you need outside heating or else you'll spiral down and die. Well, Beck didn't pay attention to that. Okay, so I stayed up all night with my two patients. I kept them stabilized. Uh, I I kept their IVs going, changed the IV bottles, gave them oxygen, watched them breathe. I tied uh, chemical hand warmers around the IV bags to keep them from freezing. We had one propane heater, so I directed it alternately on Beck and on McAloo. But I really felt that what I was doing was trivial to what Beck had done for himself. But they were alive overnight. At 4 a.m., we were hoping for helicopter rescue. But at 4 a.m., we got the word that there would not be a helicopter rescue. The winds were too strong. The helicopter pilot could not fly in that kind of wind. So then I had another tough decision to make. Should I call for an over the ice evacuation? Doing that would put my two patients at risk, and also the two climbers who would be all the climbers who would be involved in actually trying to get these two guys down the mountain. That would be very dangerous. It wouldn't be me doing that, but I would be asking other climbers to risk their lives to get these guys down the mountain. The alternative was to try to wait out the wind, but it had been really windy for days. I didn't know how much longer the wind would last. And I was looking at two guys who really belonged in an ICU at an altitude where cuts won't even heal. So their condition was just compelling, and I called for the over the ice rescue. That meant going down the Western Cwm. This is a look down the Cwm. We'd have to go down the Western Cwm, down here to the ice fall, and then down over the ice fall. I was so intent on how I would be managing my two patients down the ice fall and then again at base camp that I didn't realize that the wind had died down as we had started the over the ice rescue. I was startled by the noise and then the appearance of a helicopter. There was a lull in the wind that the pilot was going to try to use to come in and make a rescue. So he was flying at 21,000 feet. The helicopter was only rated to 17,000. So he was flying 4,000 feet over the helicopter's limit. But what he was doing was flying low to the ice and using the effect of prop wash. The rotors spin down ice, normally down onto the ice. And if you fly close enough to the ice, that wind that the rotors create bounces back up against the helicopter. So it creates like a double wind. And he was using that effect of the double wind by flying low to the ice and keeping himself aloft. But the problem was that he couldn't see crevasses from the air. And every time he flew over a crevasse, he lost that double effect. And the helicopter would drop and hit on the ice and skid along the ice and bounce up and down. And he was having a lot of trouble trying to get to us. But one of our climbers got what I consider a brilliant idea. He had pink Kool-Aid in his backpack, and he took that out and with the Kool-Aid traced a trail toward us that the pilot could follow to get down to the ice. And it worked. He didn't actually land. What he did was he hovered about 1 or 2 feet off the ice because he was afraid if he actually touched the ice with his skids, they would freeze into the ice and he'd be unable to take off. So he hovered just above the ice, and we brought him our two patients. McAloo first, because he was in worse shape than Beck. We loaded McAloo into the helicopter. He could only take one at a time, so we put McAloo in first, and I was carrying a little purse of McAloo's personal belongings, And after we loaded Makalu in, I tossed that purse onto Makalu's stomach, and the pilot picked it up and threw it right out. He didn't want to take even 1 ounce more than he had to. So he took off with Makalu and brought him to base camp at 17,000. Then he unloaded Makalu, flew back up for Beck, loaded Beck, and then came back down to base camp and reloaded Makalu. And then at 17,000 feet, he felt like he could take both. So he took off and took them both to Kathmandu. And then suddenly there was silence, and suddenly the rescue was over for us. We went on down back to base camp, and we were all in a daze. It was really hard to comprehend what had happened on the mountain. We just sort of wandered around and then decided to hold a memorial service. So we all got together at Scott's base camp, and the Sherpas lit a fire of juniper wood. They believed that the juniper wood is holy, so they put it into the altar that they made and lit it and let the smoke blow over us. And then they chanted from their prayer books. We all stood around and listened as they chanted. They had their prayer books resting on oxygen crates. And then after they finished their prayers, the climbers who wanted to got up on the higher rocks and spoke from their hearts. Some of them actually turning to the mountain to speak to the climbers who were still lying up there. There was a long silence, and it seemed like everyone had finished. But then Lop Song, who was Scott Fisher's head Sherpa, got up and crying, he said, I tried and I tried and I tried, but I couldn't save him. None of us could save them. This was Scott Fisher. He said he wasn't feeling well on summit day, but Scott was Scott, and we figured he'd be okay. He disappeared somewhere above Camp 4. This is Rob Hall, probably at that time the most respected mountaineer in the world, and my friend for 10 years. Rob and I had been together in Antarctica. Rob refused to abandon a dying climber, and I would have expected no less from him. And Andy Harris, Rob's guide. He got lost in the whiteout after summiting and stepped off the east face. This is Doug Hansen, the climber that Rob died with. I had treated Doug the year before on Everest. He had frostbite of his feet. And we said, well, he's lucky because frostbite wasn't that bad. He'd be able to climb again. But this year, his luck ran out. And Yasuko Namba, the Japanese climber. She summited, but collapsed on the way down. Another climber, Neil Beidelman, was trying to drag 2 other climbers to safety in that storm. Yasuko grabbed onto Neil, and Neil tried to drag 3 climbers. He said he felt Yasuko slip off, but he didn't have the strength to pick her up. These are Tibetan prayer flags. The Sherpas believe that if you write messages and prayers on the flags, the wind will carry them up to the gods of Everest. But that year, Everest wasn't listening. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kamler. That was an incredible talk.
Thank you.
Incredible story. Yeah, at this point, if anyone has any questions, feel free to post them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. Maybe people are thinking, but I do have a question for you, Dr.
Yeah,
Kamler.
yeah,
So if if it's been a couple decades since then, if
yeah.
if this were to if this happened in 2025, if we ignore the much different infrastructure and traffic up there and we just look at the medical supplies and how medicine has changed and how wilderness medicine has changed, do you think that your patient care or your med kits, are there any big changes that you would foresee if
I don't think so. It's such a harsh remote environment. It's so hard to bring things there that I don't think you could bring very sophisticated equipment to take care of these kind of problems. I think it probably is still about the same. Now there's some people like Luann Freer run a like a clinic at the base. And they're equipped with a lot of supplies, but they're basically the same supplies that we brought along. There really isn't much more you can do there. I remember one time I was asked on one of my NASA trips to Everest, the guy in charge wrote to me uh, and said, send me a list of everything you think you need. And I sent him a list, which was pretty much the same as what I've always sent. And I thought he would say, what, you want all this stuff? It was 10 typewritten pages. But he called back and he said, okay, is there anything else you need? And, I had to think and I said, really, no, just give me that, because nothing else would be practical. He was talking about all these kind of, life support systems and automatic defibrillators and all these kind of life support things to maintain cardiac compression automatically. But that stuff's too impractical. You can't really use it on Everest. So I told him no.
all right, we do have some questions in the chat. Linda's wondering, the climbers with frostbite, do you know how they fared long term with tissue and limb loss?
Yes, I do, actually. I can tell you. Makalu Gao lost parts of both feet, uh, and Beck lost, he kept his feet, but lost all all the fingers on one hand and his arm halfway up his forearm on the other hand. Beck was a pathologist, is a pathologist. So that's one of the few areas of medicine that you can practice without hands. So Beck has a myoprosthesis for the forearm side, and he had deepening wedges cut in his nubs on the other hand. So he has a little bit of finger action, but he still works as a pathologist. He uses foot pedals to control his slides and to control his slides. And he has a PA preparing the slides for him, and then he dictates his reports into a machine. So Beck is actually a great example of positive thinking. Whenever I speak to him, he never says "poor me" or anything like that. He just says, "Oh, I got a new myoprosthesis. This one works better than the other one," and he's always very upbeat, which is an amazing testament to his fortitude, his mental strength. As for Makalu, I kept in touch with him for a while, but he had a much tougher time, if that's possible, uh, learning to walk, and he also lost a lot of the fingers on his hands, and he lost his nose. Makalu was taken from Everest to a hospital in Alaska, and he was in the hospital in rehab for a year. And then after that, he wrote that the doctors in the hospital want to give him a new nose, a prosthetic nose. And he said that's when he decided it's time to leave Alaska because he doesn't want to be fitted with a Caucasian nose. So he went back to Taiwan, and I haven't heard from him since.
All right. And Martin says, thank you for the talk. Martin was a friend of David Brescher's.
Oh, David Bashir, sure.
So David Brescher's, and he's wondering if you knew David since he was there in '96.
Yeah, I left him out of the talk just for reasons of time, but yes, I can tell you what David was on with the IMAX team. He had gone there he had planned to film a scripted movie. But when the disaster occurred, he changed his plan and filmed it as a documentary, which later came out as an IMAX film. Uh, at the time of when the disaster hit, David was down at Camp 2. He wasn't in position at that time, but he had laid in supplies up at Camp 4. And he, of course, said, use whatever supplies you need at Camp 4. He told us to just go ahead and take whatever we need. He told us what he had up there, and we liberally helped ourselves to his supplies at Camp 4. And then after Todd and Pete got control of the situation with Beck and Makalu, uh, Dave and Ed Viesters climbed up to Camp 4, and it was actually Dave and Ed who brought down Beck and Makalu to me at Camp 2. So that was the role he played.
Hi,
All
Dr.
right.
Kamler. I just wanted to say thank you. I read your books like 4 or 5 years ago, and you've really
No,
been an
thank you.
inspiration. I was just wondering, like, I'm about to start residency, hopefully, and I was wondering, like, if there's any recommendations you have for like how residents can get involved to like start doing expedition
Yeah,
medicine.
yeah, I get these letters all the time, actually. Yeah, well, you can join the Wilderness Medical Society. That's always a good start. And you can become a student member of the Explorers Club, which is what I belong to. I've been very active in the Explorers Club like forever. Uh, it's a really great organization for networking. I'm not a clubby type by any means, but the Explorers Club is made for people who aren't clubbies, but just like to explore. And if you get involved with them, you make incredible contacts. As a student member, it's easy to join. You can just download an application. If you like, I could sponsor you. Send me your resume, and I'm sure you would be qualified. It doesn't, just it really takes just an interest in exploration. That doesn't make you a member. Student member is very different than a regular member, but that would make you a student member, and then you have to requalify to become a member. But you do that by actually performing on expeditions, and then you get reevaluated, and then you get selected if you're worthy, which is really not that hard actually. But that way you get to meet explorers. Where do you live? Where are you in school?
I go to school in DC, but I'm gonna match hopefully this week, like at the end of the week, to so I don't know where I'm gonna live until
Okay,
next.
well, there are Explorers Club chapters all over the country. And so there's a big one in DC actually. So once you become a member, you can, if you're near New York, that's the best because the main headquarters is in New York. But wherever you are, you can contact the local chapter, and they can introduce you around to the local explorers, and you can come to New York whenever you can. And you really get to meet a lot of exciting people doing amazing things. So join the Wilderness Medical Society, get some background, and join the Explorers Club. I think that'll actually do it. That can really get you involved.
Great, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right. Last call for questions for Dr. Kamler here. All right. If not, I think we can close it there. Dr. Kamler, again, this was amazing. Definitely one of my favorite talks of the
Oh,
last
good.
year or two or three. It's not every day you can listen to a firsthand account of stories that you read about in books. So,
Yeah, yeah.
so thank you so much for sharing your experiences. It was really an honor to have you here. Actually, looking at the chat right now, sorry to cut that off. Martin, do you have a question?
Oh, yes, Mr. Kamler, thank you for that nice presentation. As I said, I was a close friend of David Brashear's, and we were neighbor in
Oh,
Marblehead, Massachusetts.
oh, yeah.
And would you have something to say to his sister, Lisa? Because unfortunately, David passed away last year,
Yes,
as
you
you
did.
probably know.
Yeah.
So would you like to say something to Lisa, his sister, young sister?
Uh, is she listening? I don't.
No, she's not listening now, but I often see her. She's from the western part of the USA, but
Uh-huh.
she sometimes go to David's house in Marblehead. They
Mhm.
still own the house for
Huh.
now.
Yeah. Well, you can just tell her that I was with David every step of the way during that disaster, and she should be very proud of the way he handled it. He did everything he could. He couldn't have helped out more, from the position he was in. And he was the one, along with Ed Beasters, who actually brought those two critical climbers down the mountain to me. And had he not done that, they likely would have died up there. So
Yeah,
he's a hero, and you could tell her that.
thank you. She will really appreciate. We love you.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Martin. Um, all right, folks, I think we'll end it there. Again, thanks, Dr. Kamler, and thank you everyone for tuning in tonight.
Okay.
Um, this recording will be available on YouTube if you'd like to watch it again. But that's all I got. So thanks again, everyone. Hope you
Okay.
have
Thank
a
you.
good night.
Thank you all. Okay.